At 9:15 a.m., the Caribbean was exactly what naval planners like to see: calm, clear, and easy to monitor. The morning haze had already lifted, leaving open water in every direction under bright skies. No storms, no heavy traffic, no distractions. A U.S. carrier strike group moved steadily through international waters, carrying out routine operations. Nothing covert, nothing urgent. The carrier maintained course, its escorts held formation, and activity on the flight deck followed its usual rhythm. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary, quiet morning at sea. Then the radar picture changed. A single surface contact appeared near the far edge of the display, faint but consistent. Seconds later, another showed up, then a third. Their spacing was too deliberate to match normal commercial traffic. Their speed did not align with fishing boats or cargo ships moving through nearby lanes. Inside the Combat Information Center, there was no panic. The response was something sharper, complete concentration. Each contact was marked, tracked, and plotted. Bearings were verified, speed over ground was confirmed. This was not random background activity. This was purposeful movement. By 9:18 a.m., the pattern was obvious. The contacts were Venezuelan naval vessels operating together and closing in from the southwest. Not drifting, not pausing, closing. At first, the situation still sat in that familiar gray zone, close enough to watch, far enough to avoid open provocation. Navies shadow one another all the time. That alone is not unusual. But the next move changed the tone. At 9:22 a.m., the lead Venezuelan ship adjusted course. Not slightly, and not by mistake. It made a deliberate turn that placed it on an intercept line with the carrier's projected path. The estimated closest point of approach dropped quickly. That was when the bridge was notified. This was no longer passive observation. It had become a direct test. The carrier did not alter course. It did not slow down. It did not accelerate. In moments like this, discipline matters more than drama. Sudden moves create narratives. Steady movement creates evidence. Radio circuits were opened not to threaten, but to document. Identification procedures were prepared. Everything was logged in real time. Timestamps, bearings, speeds, distances. No interpretation, just facts. On the flight deck, operations continued. Sailors secured equipment. Aircraft crews moved with practiced efficiency. From a distance, the carrier appeared almost unaffected. That, too, was part of the message. Calm speaks for itself. Below deck, however, the ship was fully alert. Long-range radar continued sweeping the horizon. Electronic warfare teams shifted into passive collection, quietly recording every emission from the approaching vessels. No interference, no active pressure, just listening, just learning. By 9:28 a.m., the Venezuelan formation had moved closer still. The escorts adjusted their positions with careful precision, not aggressively, but enough to tighten the defensive shape around the carrier. It was a silent signal shared across the strike group. We see this, and we are ready. Still, nothing escalated. Then the radio call came. The transmission from the Venezuelan-led vessel was controlled, firm, and unmistakably political in tone. It challenged the carrier's presence and projected resolve. It was designed to be heard, recorded, and repeated. The response from the carrier was brief and professional. Identification, present position, lawful operations in international waters. No emotion, no argument, no edge in the voice. The Venezuelan ships did not turn away. They continued closing. That mattered because a U.S. aircraft carrier is never just a single ship moving across the sea. It is a fully connected system. Layers of sensors, ships linked with aircraft, every movement feeding into a larger picture. Moving close to that kind of force does not create leverage. It creates exposure. Every radar sweep reveals capability. Every maneuver reveals doctrine. Every minute spent inside that envelope gives away information that cannot be taken back. At 9:33 a.m., the distance kept shrinking. Still no rushed movement, still no outward sign of tension, just constant speed and quiet confidence. The sea remained calm, the carrier remained steady, and somewhere between the Venezuelan decision to keep pressing forward and the carrier's refusal to respond emotionally, the balance of the encounter began to shift. They came looking for a reaction. What they found instead was control. By 9:35 a.m., this was no longer chance. It was calculation. The Venezuelan ships had entered a range where intent could no longer be dismissed as routine observation. Their formation stayed loose, but clearly deliberate. One lead ship pressing ahead, the others offset as if waiting to see whether the carrier would give way. From inside the Combat Information Center, the picture was unmistakable. Speed, bearing, spacing. Every variable pointed to a measured maneuver designed to apply pressure without crossing the legal threshold into open aggression. Classic gray zone behavior. At 9:38 a.m., the closest point of approach dropped again. The lead vessel shifted course by only a few degrees, but the impact was immediate. The intercept line tightened. Time to CPA fell to just minutes. The bridge acknowledged the update without comment. No new orders, no visible reaction. The carrier held its line. In naval operations, predictability under pressure is not weakness. It is authority. The escorts responded with precision. A guided missile destroyer on the carrier's forward quarter moved slightly outward, creating a clearer buffer. Another ship mirrored the adjustment on the opposite side. The formation was not closing in aggressively. It was shaping the space, quietly reminding everyone watching that the carrier was not operating alone. Below the surface, unseen, submarines maintained their patrol geometry. Above, aircraft stood ready. The strike group was layered, complete, and patient. At 9:42 a.m., Venezuelan radio traffic increased. Short bursts, controlled transmissions. Nothing chaotic. Their goal was not confusion, it was signaling. Each message was meant to project presence, create the impression of control, and suggest that this distance had been closed on their terms. But proximity works both ways. Inside the carrier's electronic warfare compartments, technicians stayed focused on passive collection. Every shift in frequency, every change in modulation, every transmission was captured and stored. No jamming, no response, just silent observation. That is the part many rivals tend to underestimate. The closer they move in, the more they reveal. At 9:45 a.m., the Venezuelan lead vessel transmitted again, this time with a firmer tone. The message carried more political weight than operational urgency. It framed the encounter around sovereignty and resolve, rather than navigation or safety. The carrier's response did not change. It remained calm, lawful, procedural, and brief. That consistency was not accidental. On the flight deck, alert crews were now fully in position. Aircraft stood fueled and ready, but still motionless. There was no rush to launch anything. Acting too soon would have changed the atmosphere. Waiting preserved control. The Venezuelan ships continued on course. By 9:48 a.m., the two sides were close enough for visual confirmation. Through optical systems, sailors could see deck crews moving aboard the opposing ships. Helmets on, personnel near equipment, clearly attentive, clearly prepared, but not disorderly. This was no misunderstanding. The escorts recorded every visual detail with timestamps and coordinates. In modern naval encounters, documentation matters just as much as deterrence. Proof matters. At 9:51 a.m., the situation reached a quiet turning point. The Venezuelan formation hesitated, not stopping, not turning away, but easing slightly. It was a subtle change, visible only to trained eyes. They were waiting for the carrier to flinch, waiting for a turn, a speed adjustment, a launch, any visible move they could present as a reaction. It never happened. The carrier strike group remained steady, course unchanged, speed constant, formation intact. That restraint carried real weight because the longer the encounter continued without escalation, the clearer the imbalance became. One side was trying to force acknowledgement, the other was quietly taking control of the moment. By 9:55 a.m., the Venezuelan ships had gained nothing operationally. No concession, no course change, no response they could claim as leverage. And with every passing minute, the cost of remaining close grew higher. They were no longer testing resolve, they were exposing themselves to it. The challenge had been made. The answer had already been delivered, not through force, but through discipline. And that discipline was about to steer the encounter in a direction the Venezuelan commanders no longer controlled. By 10:02 a.m., the strike group entered a new phase of awareness. Not escalation, clarity. From the outside, almost nothing appeared different. The carrier still held course. Speed remained steady. No dramatic movement interrupted the scene. But inside the formation, everything was now synchronized. A decision had been made to clear the uncertainty, not through aggression, but through presence. At 10:04 a.m., the carrier approved limited flight activity. This was not a move intended to threaten, but one designed to observe. A single aircraft was brought to readiness on the flight deck. Its movement was visible, deliberate, unmistakable. The message was restrained but clear. Options existed. The Venezuelan ships noticed. Long-range optics and radar returns made that obvious. Flight deck movement on a U.S. Carrier is never casual, and professionals know how to read it. The atmosphere shifted, not because anyone had become reckless, but because intent could no longer be missed. Inside the Combat Information Center, the operational picture was complete. Surface tracks were stable. The airspace remained clear. Subsurface conditions were secure. Across every domain, the strike group held full situational awareness. That is the quiet strength of a carrier, not what it shows, but what it understands. At 10:08 a.m., passive collection continued while Venezuelan transmissions remained steady. But the tone had changed. Earlier calls carried more confidence. These now sounded measured, cautious, coordinated. The commanders on the other side were reassessing. The escorts refined their geometry once again, not by reducing distance, but by tightening angles. The formation became even more exact. It was the difference between simply being present and controlling the space around you. Then an aircraft lifted off and climbed into the bright Caribbean sky. No sharp turns, no aggressive posture, just altitude, visibility, and overwatch. From above, the entire encounter could now be observed, recorded, and preserved. The Venezuelan ships did not answer with speed. They answered with caution. By 10:12 a.m., their formation began to stretch. Small spacing changes, minor course corrections, not a withdrawal yet, but no longer a true advance. Momentum had faded. This is where most confrontations really shift, not in a dramatic flash, but in the moment one side realizes the balance has changed, and pressing forward now carries more risk than reward. On the carrier's bridge, no one celebrated. No one spoke in dramatic terms. That lack of reaction was part of the approach. Calm leaves no room for theater. Calm leaves no easy storyline. At 10:15 a.m., the Venezuelan lead vessel reduced speed slightly, barely noticeable to an untrained eye, but at sea, even small adjustments speak clearly. They were easing back just enough to create space without openly admitting it. The aircraft overhead maintained its pattern. The escorts held position. The carrier remained unchanged. Now every move by the Venezuelan ships had become reactive. And that was the costly realization. They had approached believing that closing the distance could force engagement, create leverage, or generate political value. Instead, they had stepped into a controlled environment where every second favored the side with nothing to prove. At 10:18 a.m., Venezuelan radio traffic briefly increased, then dropped again. Coordination was still happening, just not where it could be heard easily. The carrier did not respond. It had no need to. By that point, the encounter was no longer about challenge. It was about exposure. The longer the Venezuelan ships remained inside that operational envelope, the more they exposed. Command patterns, formation habits, reaction timing. At that point, they were no longer testing the carrier. The carrier was analyzing them. At 10:22 a.m., the Venezuelan formation adjusted course by a few degrees, slowly increasing the distance. It wasn't a dramatic pullback. No clear signal of defeat, just quiet acknowledgement. The carrier was fully aware, fully prepared, and it hadn't needed to raise the intensity to show it. The encounter was already moving toward its conclusion, not through force, but through realization. By 10:27 a.m., there was no longer any room to frame the situation differently. The Venezuelan ships were still present, still visible, but no longer advancing. They held a distance that offered no advantage and carried growing risk. This is usually the moment when experienced commanders step away cleanly and close the situation on their own terms. That didn't happen. Instead, the formation hesitated, and that hesitation made all the difference. At sea, staying close without a clear purpose quickly turns into exposure. Every additional minute inside another force's operational space becomes an exchange of information you don't control. By remaining there without escalating or disengaging, the Venezuelan ships gave up the initiative completely. Inside the strike group, the shift was immediate but invisible. At 10:29 a.m., operations moved into what could be described as full-spectrum collection. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just deeper integration. Surface sensors, airborne systems, and electronic monitoring all merged into a single, precise picture. The Venezuelan ships were no longer just being tracked. They were being understood. Every radar return was categorized, every transmission analyzed. Course changes were studied not just as movement, but as decision-making. Who was leading, who was following, how quickly orders moved across the formation. This is where situations like this are truly decided, long before any visible escalation is even considered. At 10:33 a.m., an airborne platform adjusted its altitude slightly, refining sensor coverage over the Venezuelan formation. The change was subtle, but it improved visibility. Cameras recorded everything. Infrared systems captured engine signatures. Signal intercepts filled in the remaining gaps. From a distance, nothing seemed unusual. Inside the system, everything had shifted. The Venezuelan commanders were now facing a difficult set of options, one they had created themselves. If they pushed further, they risked crossing a boundary they couldn't afford to cross. If they pulled away too quickly, they gave up the encounter entirely. And if they stayed, they continued providing valuable insight to a force built to benefit from exactly that. They stayed. By 10:36 a.m., small inconsistencies began to appear in their formation. Slight delays between maneuvers, minor differences in speed, subtle signs of uncertainty, nothing major, but enough to be noticed, and everything was recorded. The carrier did not react. It stayed on course, completely steady. That steadiness made the imbalance even clearer. This situation had never been about who could move closer. It was about who could afford to wait. At 10:40 a.m., Venezuelan radio traffic dropped sharply. Internal coordination replaced external messaging. Decisions were being made out of sight. And once again, time favored only one side. At 10:43 a.m., the lead Venezuelan vessel adjusted course again, gradually increasing the distance without formally announcing withdrawal. Speed decreased slightly. The rest of the formation followed. Quiet, controlled, unspoken. But it was a withdrawal all the same. The real mistake was not the approach itself. Navies observe each other. That's expected. The mistake was staying too long in a space where the outcome was never going to work in their favor. They had revealed how they operate under pressure, how they communicate when uncertain, how quickly or slowly they adapt when faced with steady control. Those insights don't fade. By 10:47 a.m., the Venezuelan ships were clearly disengaging. No sharp breakaway. They simply eased out of the situation as if it had reached its natural end. The carrier strike group did not follow. It didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already happened. The challenge had led nowhere. The information had been gathered. The message had been delivered without a single dramatic move. From the Venezuelan side, it may have seemed like nothing significant had taken place. From a strategic perspective, quite a lot had. They had approached one of the most capable naval forces in the world. And the cost came not in spectacle, but in what they revealed. The sea remained calm as the distance grew, but the impact of that morning would last long after the radar picture cleared. By 10:55 a.m., the encounter was effectively over. The Venezuelan ships continued opening the gap, their formation loosening as they moved back toward open water. No final statements, no attempt to shape the narrative, just silence. The carrier strike group stayed on course. No pursuit, no visible reaction. Escorts returned to standard positions. Aircraft shifted back to routine patterns. From a distance, it might have looked like nothing important had happened. That illusion is part of how modern naval power works, because the most important results are not meant to be seen. Inside the carrier's command spaces, the work continued. Sensor logs were finalized, recorded data was verified, electronic signatures were cataloged and passed to analysts far beyond the immediate area. What had been gathered that morning wasn't dramatic footage or headline material. It was something more valuable. Patterns, how the Venezuelan ships approached, when their confidence peaked, the exact moment hesitation appeared, how decisions changed once it became clear the carrier would not react emotionally. Those are the details that shape future encounters. This was never about forcing a confrontation. It was about removing uncertainty. Every Navy studies potential rivals. Every commander prepares for scenarios that may never happen. But nothing replaces real interaction under pressure. In that sense, the decision to move in provided insight without triggering escalation. And the lesson goes beyond this single moment. An aircraft carrier is not just a presence to challenge by closing distance. It is a mobile system designed to manage space, time, and information at once. Approaching it under calm conditions in open waters does not create leverage. It creates imbalance. For Venezuela, the encounter brought no clear advantage, no visible outcome to point to. What it produced instead was deeper analysis, clearer understanding, and stronger preparation for future operations by the other side. For the carrier strike group, the morning reinforced a simple idea. Restraint is not a lack of strength. It is the ability to use strength only when it truly matters. No warning shots, no rushed launches, no dramatic statements afterward. That silence was intentional, because when nothing appears to happen, the other side is left to explain the gap between expectation and reality on its own. And that gap can be difficult to ignore. As the Caribbean returned to its normal rhythm, the strike group continued forward, unchanged and unchallenged. The Venezuelan ships disappeared from radar. Their intentions remained unclear. Their goals remained unfulfilled. But the lesson stayed. You don't approach a carrier just to see how it reacts. You approach it, and in doing so, you often reveal more than you expect. So the question remains, was it a calculated signal meant for messaging and perception, or a misstep that revealed more than intended? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested in more real-world encounters where influence is measured not by noise, but by control, awareness, and discipline, stay with us. Because in modern naval dynamics, the quiet outcomes often carry the most meaning.